That makes a lot of sense. And perhaps telling more stories as well without, doing it in a way that's manipulative, that sometimes can happen with populism, but just telling a story, that's how people learn, right? So I haven't read all of your book. Have you explored that in your book?
Sure, and part of it's a question of looking at different situations or different, let's call them mythologies that have gained a certain traction in the popular imagination and challenging them with a narrative that tells a different story. So, for example, in one of the chapters of this book, one of the things I do is look at the situation of manufacturing, right? So we are told over and over again that America has been hollowed out. How many times have we heard Democrats and Republicans say that manufacturing has been hollowed out, etc.? Well, in a certain sense, that's true for some parts of the manufacturing world in the United States, but it's worth telling some stories about why that has happened. So if you look at the case of, say, Detroit, which is a classic example of, let's call it Rust Belt, manufacturing collapse, etc., that has very little to do with competition from abroad or domestic. That has everything to do with complacent management, overmighty unions, and regulators and governments that didn't challenge them to change what was effectively a very stable but nonetheless complacent status quo. So to tell the story of a city like Detroit and say, this is what happened, it had nothing to do with markets, it had everything to do with collusion, cronyism, and complacency. Another story I tell is on the other side of the manufacturing story, which is when we talk about this Rust Belt, when we talk about manufacturing disappearing in the United States, well, both of those things are not quite true. We know, for example, and I point to different studies that have shown this, that most manufacturing towns have actually turned around. They're actually doing fine. Now, the process of changing from the late 1970s onwards was difficult, it was hard, and I don't want to downplay how difficult that was, but nonetheless, they changed, and now they're much more prosperous than they used to be. Whereas it's those towns, those manufacturing towns, that have appealed to the government for subsidies, for help, for different forms of intervention, they are still stuck in this unsustainable, unproductive status quo. So those are two stories that I use to challenge some of the mythologies about manufacturing in America today. And also another one is to say, look, if you go into any factory today in the United States, you look around, what do you see? Well, I tell you what, you don't see men walking around dressed as if it's the 1950s, engaged in very hard, physically demanding, often back-breaking work. What you see are men and women walking around wearing lab coats, engaged in highly sophisticated technological manufacturing, and doing work that's intellectually challenging, that gives them a sense that they're really achieving a great deal of things, and they're doing it in a way that's frankly much more comfortable than their forebears or their grandparents were doing in 1950s America. So there's a good story to tell about manufacturing in America, which I think would go some way to countering some of the mythologies that have been propagated by economic nationalists on the right and left in America.
So what I'm also getting from those stories, and I'd like you to point out if this is true or false or somewhere in the middle, is that markets and market economies tend to have wealth over time, and it takes time. And sometimes you'll have periods that are more difficult. And when people want instant results, they point to those periods and say, hey, well, this is not working out very well. We can't just let this go this way. And then interventionist policies start to come in. Is that kind of what goes on?
Absolutely. What you're describing is what people used to call the business cycle, right? So there are highs and lows. We have recessions because these are correctives to misallocations of capital and resources throughout the economy. But the thing about markets is that over the long term, everyone gets more prosperous. So yes, there are downturns. Yes, there are periods in which it's very tempting to think, okay, things are not so good right now. Let's get the government in to come and help us to fix our situation. The problem with doing that is that you actually store up more problems for the future. I often like to say that one of the big differences between, let's call it, a market-orientated approach to the economy and a more Keynesian and a more interventionist approach to the economy is that those of us who believe in market economies are thinking about the long term, not just the next year or 2 years, but the next 10, 15, 20, 30, 50, 100 years. The Keynesian interventionist tends to focus on the immediate. They focus upon the short term, which means they're much more willing to contemplate using the state to try and rectify what is, to their mind, a problem that requires immediate state intervention. Otherwise, some seriously bad things will start to happen. Problem is that when those interventions tend to have lots of unintended consequences, they also introduce rigidities and future problems into the economy that at some point are going to have to be addressed. So the Keynesian, because they tend to take this relatively short-term perspective on economic life and economic growth and the market as a whole, that's why I think they tend to look to the government to try and fix the situation or ignite growth or whatever it happens to be through different types of intervention. Those of us who believe in markets understand, or at least accept, that if you're going to have a boom, there's probably going to be a down cycle to that. Now, that's not to minimize the difficulty and often the suffering that occurs as a consequence of that, but the alternative is to go for these constant short-term fixes that in the long term create more and more problems that at some point are going to come home to roost in a big way, like they did in the 1970s. After 30 years of more or less Keynesian policies across the West, we ended up with stagflation, and breaking stagflation was extremely difficult, extremely painful. And if you're a free marketer, you would say, this could have all been avoided. We could have avoided all this if we'd been willing to say no to sort of more or less constant intervention from the 1940s onwards.